Hi, everyone. My name is Beth Rabbit, and I work for the Learning Accelerator. We're a national nonprofit that believes every child has the right to a highly effective, engaging, and equitable education, one that supports them to meet their unique and full potential. As part of our work in response to COVID-19 and related school closures, our team has been developing a number of resources to support educators in remote learning. This is the first in a three-part series of presentations we created for school leaders across the country to understand how to drive quality and improvement in remote learning implementation. And this section of the module series is focused on basic intros to remote learning. I've made a recording for those who might want to have a little bit of voiceover with slides, or who might want a little bit of direction as they prepare for delivering this series on their own. As I mentioned, this is a three-part module series. Session A, which I'm covering now, is an introduction to remote learning. It's really focused on understanding how to set up a vision and the structures for remote learning implementation and success in your school or your district or your classroom. Sessions B and C will build on this module by focusing more deeply on how to drive remote instruction quality and improvement, the actual practices that you might put in place within a remote learning design. And session C is focused on building the capacity of other educators, focused on, hey, how do we do PD remotely? So our assessment objectives for this recording are fourfold. First, we want folks to understand what remote learning is and looks like and get clarity about some of the terms and structures that you may be hearing. Second, we want to share some research-based design factors that we've identified that support the implementation of remote learning with quality and rigor, including how to build a strong foundation for student learning at home and designing effective remote instruction. We want to explore some resources and ways to take action. And then finally, have you, as learner, experience some remote learning with varied modalities? We learn to do the work by doing the work. Now, in this recording, I won't be facilitating as if I were running a live session, but I will tell you where we would go and what we'd expect you to do. Our agenda, if we were in a live session, would be 75 minutes. We encourage facilitators to make adjustments as appropriate to their own context. This session can be broken up. We could also make it longer into a workshop to give people more time for processing engagement with each other online. We actually kicked this session off with a poll asking people to reflect on this question, or this statement rather. Remote learning is ineffective. Now, many of us, given our own experiences or what we understand about online learning, might say true. We're not sure. Well, this is where we share some of the research, which is essentially remote learning can be as effective as in-person instruction. We love this quote from a very well-regarded and critical study of online charter schools, which stated, in the history of education technology research, it's well established that technology is a delivery mechanism. In other words, whether something is online or face-to-face has no direct impact on student learning outcomes. Now, as I mentioned, this study was critical of online schools because it found that many of the charter schools it studied actually didn't perform as well as more traditional in-person models. But what the authors are quick to point out is that it's not about online versus offline, but rather how we are building implementation supports and how well we are engaging students in instruction regardless of the modality. At the same time, implementation of remote learning is quite significantly different. In studies where online and face-to-face instruction were described as identical, so where curricular materials and instruction didn't vary very much, they underperformed those studies in which actually teachers were making differences between the type of learning and instruction that was happening in person versus remote. Different approaches to remote learning, so modalities actually suit different types of tasks and content. We have to make smart choices. Remote learners who are treated just the same as face-to-face learners, so who are just lectured at, don't perform as well. And in remote environments, students are much more self-directed. And so the dimension of learner control is an important part of readiness that we have to factor in as educators. And then finally, presence of teachers, mentors, and peers still really matter. And so we need to acknowledge that in remote environments. In other words, remote learning isn't worse, isn't better, it's different. And so working remotely with students poses new challenges, but also new benefits. Some of those benefits achieved through a blend of different modalities can include offering more opportunities for personalization and individual support, increasing opportunities for students to collaborate on work, development of skills for self-direction that might not be able to be developed within a traditional classroom setting, and then actually opportunities to improve interactions for some students who may come to the classroom with special needs. So as educators, as we think about the basics of remote instruction, our challenge is to figure out how to deliver on the opportunity that remote learning can provide. To do this, we have to design and deliver in ways that optimize the benefits and mitigate risks associated. So let's dig in. First, a couple of terms. I'm sure you know these or have heard these, but we like to get clear. One dimension of remote learning is whether or not the learning is happening in analog versus digital formats. Analog formats are not technology dependent. They're offline. They may include printed materials, books, assigning a workbook for students to complete independently, having in-person connections, if possible, within the context of COVID-19. Digital oftentimes means we're depending on the technology to foster the interaction between the student and the content. So that's working online together or independently, learning a skill and practicing it on a tool, or collaborating digitally on a work product. Another dimension of remote learning is whether or not the learning is happening synchronously versus asynchronously. Asynchronously means at the pace of directed by the individual learner. It can happen through a variety of modalities. It often allows for flexibility in pacing and location. It can be really time effective and efficient to accommodate different home schedules, but it also might limit more interpersonal actions. It can feel isolating for some. And the learning that happens asynchronously is highly dependent on the motivation, self-direction, and choice-making of the learner. Synchronous happens when learners are learning together. They're working at the same time. Oftentimes digitally, this is by Zoom or video conferencing. It's via any tool that allows learners to interact at the same time. It's often very collaborative with feedback that can happen immediately, which can be really helpful for our younger learners. And when students are engaged, can offer really high levels of interaction. At the same time, it's schedule and time dependent, and it can lack individual attention and flexibility. And the session quality is highly dependent on the skills of the facilitator or instructor. Mapping these two dimensions together, what we see is we have a landscape of remote learning and the different strategies we might use depending on whether or not something is synchronous, asynchronous, analog, or digital. What this 2x2 essentially shows us is that different strategies can be supported in different formats and modalities. A synchronous and digital experience might be small groups collaborating on a phone call or a phone check-in. An analog and asynchronous experience, that is something that happens offline and independently, could be having a student read a book, creating a physical work product. If it's digital and asynchronous, it means that we are potentially watching a pre-recorded video as part of a playlist or providing feedback to a peer in Google Doc comments. If we're working synchronously and analog, that is offline and together, we're most likely in person. These modalities are essentially the building blocks for creating a student's remote instructional experience. And like any in-person learning experience, teachers need to match the modality to their objectives as well as their context. That can be the student needs that they're trying to fill, the need for engagement, the content area, as well as level of the learner. Younger learners need different things than older learners need. The best approaches will blend them. We like to say they will blend them into what is basically a well-balanced meal for an experience for students. The blending can happen actually within a session or can happen over the course of the school day. This is a sample remote learning daily schedule in which you see at one point in the day, a teacher could be working with a teacher-led synchronous working group online, followed by iStation reading, which is student-directed independent practice. Students the next day might actually be watching a recorded session and then working on work product. There are lots of choices we make, and students experience a variety of modalities within the day, and sometimes even with lessons within a high-quality remote environment. So, what supports effective remote learning? In our work at TLA, we've actually spent quite a bit of time in the research phase. We've worked with lots and lots of schools that work with online tools and technologies, oftentimes in the classroom, over the course of our work over the last nearly 8 years. What we believe is there are essentially two big quality design factors we have to pay attention to. The first is we have to create a foundation for self-directed learning. That is, an approach that fosters the development of the student skills and readiness through partnerships with families and other at-home networks, as well as meeting the comprehensive needs that students need to have met in order to engage effectively in whatever instruction is we create. The second piece is effective instruction itself, which we believe has basically three quality factors. The first is technology, which enables the interaction of the student with teachers and content and peer. The second is the actual pedagogy that offers rigorous content and active mastery-oriented learning strategies to support students' transfer of new concepts and skills to memory, as well as application to tasks. And then finally, we focus on relationships. Online learning environments are often reported to be isolating, and it's difficult for students sometimes to persevere. By amping up our commitment to relationship building, by building social connections and personalizing, meaning increasing students' relationship and understanding to the content and tasks and activities we're trying to ask them to personally engage in, we can actually really solve for some of the challenges that online learning can create. So first, let's start with the foundation for self-directed learning. Quick check, and this is what we do in a regular session. Have you been tuned in? Are you totally engaged? Are you potentially multitasking? Do you have this presentation on the background while you do dishes? Are you cuddling with puppies? In my case, I have a dog snoring in the background. We offer this poll as a quick check because oftentimes adults, we talk about the importance and the challenge of student self-directed learning when in fact we are self-directing all the time. And what we know as adults is it's really hard to pay attention all the time in these environments. And so I want to just remind ourselves that this is a complex thing and that the more we can set students up for success, to self-direct and to support and engage from home, the better off we'll be. So the big takeaway here is remote learning, whether synchronous or asynchronous, whether we like it or not as educators, relies on learners to exert much greater self-regulation and direction. The research suggests that self-direction is a complex process that requires understanding our needs and establishing and monitoring our progress towards the goals we set. It requires wayfinding and identifying resources, both the people, but the material resources that we need for learning. We have to learn to plug in our computers, for example. And we have to also choose appropriate and effective strategies for us as learners. Another important thing to note is that our capacity to do this is likely dependent on domain and beliefs. So our ability to be self-directed in one subject area, in one task, doesn't necessarily always translate universally to others. So we have to build our competency in all areas. And importantly, as educators, we have to assume that a student that is highly competent in self-direction in one area might not be as competent in another. So how can we proactively support students to be independent learners? First off, we have to help them build the skills. So we have to set and model clear expectations and norms for engagement and communication, showing students what it looks like with a positive, human, empathic lens to effectively engage as remote learners. We have to give them parameters around how to set up a good workspace that works for them, how to organize their daily schedule and manage their time and tasks effectively, how to identify where to look for tasks and when they're due and what they should look like. One strategy that we think is really important is offering students concrete ways to seek help. Help seeking in remote environments can be as simple as asking a question in chat, but that asking of a question might in fact be disruptive to a synchronous lesson. We need to be really clear with students as to which ways they can find help and how. One great strategy we've linked within this document is called 3 Before Me, which is giving students the opportunity to check with 3 different people or other resources before reaching out to you as an educator. We should encourage self-reflection and goal setting. So setting SMART goals, for example, or reflecting on goals that we set at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, can be really effective strategies. And finally, we cannot underestimate the importance of parents as partners in this process. As educators, we need to communicate early and often about expectations and needs and plans. We also need to give them concrete strategies for supporting their students. Parents oftentimes, according to the literature, underestimate their ability to affect a student's academic development. We know that they're very powerful partners in this work, and setting them up for success proactively in a personalized and, again, empathic way is really important. Next, it's important to recognize that supporting students at home means recognizing that they are developing across many domains, not just academic. Um, it's often said that learning is, for example, the intrinsic and interrelated relationship between cognition and motivation, for example. Our ability to learn is affected by how we are feeling mentally and physically and emotionally. Now, as an educator, it can be a little overwhelming to imagine meeting all of these needs, but there are 3 places you can start. 1, try to understand the needs. How can you get data as an educator on where students are learning and in what domains? Second, how do you adopt and maybe integrate practices, so for example, coaching and support directly, into your day-to-day instruction? And finally, who are the partners that you can find to help you out as you move forward? This is a framework that we like to point to. There are many frameworks for comprehensive student development or whole child support. This is one example. It's called the Comprehensive Student Development Framework that was developed by the Chan-Zuckerberg Initiative that posits there are 6 developmental domains, all of which are interrelated and support each other as students are learning in school. In addition to academic development, we have our cognitive development, our physical health, our mental health, our social emotional development, and our identity development. Now, as educators, there are some just simple strategies we can think about. Can we ask students and their families about well-being? Can we develop a list of external community supports we can point people to? Can we ourselves model personal emotional check-ins and sharing in order to humanize the process of learning? Can we encourage brain breaks and movement during the day, or proactively ask about the accommodations that students might need rather than having to bring an IEP or accommodations to the table? Can we provide calming and centering strategies, or partner with a provider who can? Can we do one-on-one advising to develop strategies to meet goals, or can we just build in opportunities for self-reflection and dialogue? All these are small but really meaningful practices we can think of as having extra importance in remote learning, particularly within the wake of COVID-19. So many students experience trauma during school shutdowns that we need to be extra aware of the culture and the supports that we can provide that will allow students to engage academically in the content we want them to. So questions to ask as you consider your school's vision plan. Have we articulated clear expectations for remote learning, as well as what those supports are for them? Are we as educators providing specific modeling and support for self-direction? Are we engaging consistently and clearly with families as partners in learning? Are we prioritizing relationships? And are we aware of specific non-academic needs and how we might support them? So that's the foundation. Now we move on to instruction. Remote education is first and foremost. The purpose of school is about the creation of powerful learning experiences for students. So here, I want to note we'll be tackling specific remote instructional practices. That is, the moves a teacher might integrate within any lesson in Module B. But in this module, we want to explore what we know about the research from the design of online instruction, and also ask you to consider how these design factors fit into your current instructional vision. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 design factors we think that influence instruction delivered online. The first is technology factors. So technology is the vehicle that serves to connect learners to teachers to content to peers within a remote environment. Now, technology might be very fancy and have bells and whistles like a robust LMS. It can also be as simple as a Google site, or it can be analog technology like paper printouts and phone calls. So there are 4 questions we seek to ask. One is, how accessible is the technology that we've chosen? Both actually physically, do all of our students have access to the technology that they need, as well as cognitively? So for those learners who may have specific learning differences, can they access in a universal way the tools and materials that we've chosen for them? The next is ease and support. So the literature would say that our ability to persevere in an online environment, our willingness to accept, if you will, that in the technology acceptance model, the technology is a factor of our belief about our ability to use the technology well, the extent to which we believe it will be easy, that we can access the resource we need, and that when we need help, we can actually find support. The same, by the way, is true for us as educators too. Third, the match. So how well does the tool, in terms of mode, in terms of feature and function, actually match our goals and our context for instruction? So our goals, meaning the learning objectives and the activities we want students to engage in, but also the context of the classrooms we're working in. Are we working with younger learners or older learners, for example? Which content area are we working in? And then finally, organization. So technology can impose a burden, a cognitive load that if we don't manage it well, means that students will spend too much time and energy dealing with the cognitive load of navigating and using the technology, and they won't spend any cognitive load on the actual task of learning around the content and activities we're developing. We can reduce the cognitive load by really making sure all our resources are easy to access, organized, are available in consistently designed bite-sized formats. Next up, pedagogy. So the things that enable strong teaching and learning anywhere, but are particularly important in remote environments. The first is rigorous content. Are we engaging students in the content that they need to be engaged in based on their grade level and learning needs and high expectations for all? That means the materials that include the online materials, the analog materials, as well as related assessments and tools we might use in either a core or supplementary fashion. When we begin to ask questions about content, we both want to ask, is it rigorous? Is it aligned to our learning objectives and standards? As well as, is it actually effective digitally? And how well does it align to other tools and resources? How interoperable is it with other resources I might be using? Next up, active learning. So how are we encouraging students during sessions to engage deeply, to exert cognitive effort, to interact with the concepts and ideas that we are asking them to interact with? Are we giving them opportunities for metacognition? Are we asking them to engage in retrieval and reflection? Are they engaging discourse with their peers? These are all ways that we can make learning more active. And in remote instruction, it's really important because it's very easy to passively digest that which is provided to us over a screen. Finally, mastery learning. So we've spent a lot of time recently worrying about students' levels of engagement in remote learning, when candidly, what we really want to be focused on is, are students learning? So what are the structures and the processes that we're setting up to build opportunities for students to self-assess, to practice, to get coaching and specific feedback, and to build their competency and show that they are mastering material over time? Finally, we have relationship factors, which as I explained before, are the secret sauce to ensuring students are motivated and committed in remote learning environments. The first is we need to build connection. Learning online can feel isolated, and even more so given the level of disconnection we're all feeling during COVID-19. So it's really important that educators seek to build social presence that isn't experienced as a function of geography, but is experienced as a function of affect and connection between the learner and the teacher. So expert teacher presence, and learners and peers. And that's done through both being present, but also collaborating in learning and really creating the experience of a learning community. It's not something that happens organically, and we have to work on it, especially hard in remote environments. Next up is personalization. So what this means is providing resources and learning opportunities that are individually relevant and meaningful to the learner. It's about having flexibility for learners to make choices, to self-pace, to get the resources that they need to set goals, but also targeting resources to meet their personal needs and interests. So offering differentiation and personal opportunities to make connections to the work. Both of these put together allow individuals to motivate and persevere and deepen their commitment to the tasks of learning that we're creating. So questions to ask. First, with technology, Do students have universal access, physical and cognitive, to the resources they need? Are they easy to navigate? And do they have the features and functions we actually need to support our objectives for teaching and learning? Do we have, particularly at the school level, common norms for organizing content and features? There's nothing more frustrating for a student to have the game changed between classes when they're just figuring out how to navigate in one content area. How much time are they spending navigating versus learning? Are we providing adequate training, and do students know where and how to get support? In terms of pedagogy, do our current materials actually work well in digital formats? And are they aligned to the standards we need them to be aligned to? And are they ideally interoperable? Or in other words, do they play well with one another? This is really important on the interoperability front to ensure that we're protecting students' data and privacy by not downloading personally identifiable data and sending it, for example, as a spreadsheet on email. We need to focus on whether or not the tools are giving us data in the formats we need to adequately protect students and their information. Do the formats we're offering actually engage students in the tasks of learning? Are we activating prior knowledge, retrieving, reflecting, connection making, and having discourse? How are we assessing mastery within this environment? Or how are we offering opportunities for students to deliberately practice with feedback from you as a teacher, with feedback from peers, to get better and to ultimately master or show mastery of knowledge, skills, and competencies? And how are we delivering targeted interventions and opportunities for acceleration based on where students are vis-a-vis their mastery and needs? Finally, relationships. So how are teachers going to build strong ongoing presence with their learners? Are we building a sense of community? Are we encouraging peer engagement in ways that connect to learning objectives? So not just around the edges of instruction, but within instruction itself. How are we helping students see the relevance of tasks based on their goals? How are we helping them connect to the tasks of learning? And can students ideally make scaffolded but appropriate choices to build their agency and reinforce all those self-directed learning skills? So at this point in the session, we'd ask you to go into independent learning time. The link provided in the document gives you access to a variety of playlists on different topics we've discussed. The resource guide should be used by learners within this session to explore different domains of support. We've actually broken independent learning and whole child supports because they are slightly different topics in this session. And then as they're working, identify at least one strategy or idea you would put into action, or an aha or a question. We're going to take those strategies, questions, and ahas to the next part of the session, which is small group exploration. So in this case, TLA would facilitate small breakout groups where we'd have individuals share the information about themselves to build a little bit of connection, and then to share out their resource, their aha, or their question, and have a common conversation about what patterns emerged or ideas they're having. And then each group should arrive by the end of this part of the session with one common thought or wondering that they want to share out. Finally, we'd facilitate in whole group a conversation sharing some of the patterns. So we would ask folks to, one per group, to unmute, turn on their video, say their name and role, and share that one thing, the question, the aha, or the interesting. You can also have folks chat this in the chat box. And particularly important, if someone's referring to a resource they found particularly helpful, others may not have seen it, so have them include that. Then we move to close. We like to close at TLA with something called a post-it promise, or a commitment. We want folks to leave the session with the idea about one thing they're going to do or use from this session. So we ask people to write one thing that they promise to apply to their work in the next week or month, maybe even the next day, and then to share it in the chat so others can see what types of commitments are being made and be inspired themselves. We'd like to note that this module is part of a 3 series. You can find it where you found this module. There's also a lot of other free and open resources our organization has created in response to COVID. We'd refer people to alwaysreadyforlearning.org to be able to find those variety of resources, specifically a coaching network. So through philanthropic support, we've been able to set up free customized coaching for any school leader in the country on any remote learning topic they need help with, be it reviewing and making a plan for certain technologies, identifying personalized professional development plans, or even figuring out finance or tech issues. We've also got a resource hub of resources that all of our experts have crowdsourced together as the best that they think are out there to support your work. And then finally, we have the Parabola Project, which offers guidance and actionable resources for reopening, seeking to maximize learning while minimizing risk in partnership with our healthcare partner, Ariadne Labs. I'd like to thank you all for all the great work you're doing. We look forward to getting feedback, and we hope this was helpful.